It's kind of interesting because not a lot of people have heard about the Negro Motorists Green Book, so I'm going to share a little bit with you. And the book was published from like 1936 to 1966. A little bit about the history of it. The post-Reconstruction Jim Crow era ran from roughly 1877 to like 1954. That's just everything encompassed. And during that time, thousands of former slaves, their descendants, and free blacks continued the migration out of the South to the North and West, looking for opportunities and a departure from the oppressive climate many found in the South. Now, patterned after the black codes of the pre-Civil War era, the collective group of state and local laws referred to as Jim Crow laws sought to restrict the movements of blacks. Separate drinking fountains, restrooms, entrances, seating arrangements were just some of the more visible restrictions put in place, but there were other considerations for blacks when it came to travel. Where could you lodge, get gasoline, get your car repaired, eat a meal? These and other considerations were factors in traveling. To be prepared, you had to pack food, and that means extra food, a can or another implement to use in lieu of a toilet, bedding, and even extra gasoline. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine having a car with a can that you've used for bodily functions and then knowing that there's a big container of gasoline behind you in the back seat. You also had to choose your route wisely and know which communities were safe to travel through and which to avoid completely. Sundown towns were those built and maintained specifically to keep minorities out. As late as the 1960s, there were still about 10,000 such communities. And blacks, Jews, Hispanics, Chinese, and often those of different religious groups were made to feel unwelcome in some communities. Such towns would post signs at the city limits warning, in particular blacks, in no certain terms, to stay out or leave before sundown. In some communities, blacks would be at greater risk of being stopped by police, often for no cause, or by groups of vigilantes. And during such stops, you faced intimidation, threats, physical harm, and in some cases, death. At times, there were motorists who simply just disappeared, never reaching their intended destination and never heard from again. At this point, let me interject a little bit about what was going on in the Youngstown area during that time. Post-Civil War, prior to 1900, you had a number of blacks that had moved in that first migration from the South to the North. That wave, along with another influx, which occurred between 1950 and 1930, there were sizable numbers of Southern blacks all looking to get into the mills, industrial businesses and everything away from agriculture. And that put a squeeze on members of ethnic groups which were already here, already trying to get and maintain jobs, and were already working. Along with each group, they brought their own cultures, religious beliefs, and values, which often did not mesh with those who were already here, increasing the amount of rancor among the groups. Now, for about a 15-year period, starting in 1915, the Valley saw a rise in the supporters of and the activity amongst the Ku Klux Klan. In 1923, Charles F. Scheibel, who was an outspoken proponent of the Klan, was elected Youngstown mayor. 1924, you had the riot up in Niles, which the information on that you can find in the Ohio History Connection site. And in June of the following year, 1925, there was a Flag Day observance in Tuscarawas County at the Protestant Home Farm just west of New Philadelphia to celebrate the burning of the mortgage for the property. At that time, the Klan membership had grown in that county from about 80 to about 10,000 members. The speaker for that day was Judge Clyde W. Osborne of Youngstown, who was the state organization's Grand Dragon. You had Campbell, Niles, North Lima, Springfield, and several other communities in this area that had segments of Klan supporters. Now, by 1928, the influence of the Klan had begun to decline, but there were other battles for blacks here. Redlining, which means relegating blacks and other minorities to certain sections of towns or neighborhoods, and other subtle and not so subtle forms of harassment would continue for decades to come. Often trying to get some of the older members of the African American community to talk about experiences during slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow to segregation and civil rights, that has been hard. So it's been difficult, at least for me, to get them, some of the ones in my family in particular, to open up. I don't know how many of you know, but I think I mentioned that I was in South Carolina recently for a funeral. Drove down on Tuesday and we came back Friday morning so I could bake cookies. When I was in South Carolina for this funeral, I started asking questions like I normally do. Thankfully, things are a little bit more relaxed because back in the day, the women, I have a female cousin, her brothers would always get in the car with grandpa, they would go down south and that's it. And you know, I told her, I said, I felt cheated because being the oldest of 4 girls, not that I was as old as they were and that grandpa would ever take me in the first place, we didn't get to go. And it's like, why not? And they said, well, that's menfolk business, you don't want to know about that. Okay. So she didn't get to go either because she was a female. So, you know, things have sort of eased up a little bit where the boundaries of male-female roles are just a little bit softer, not much, because if you're talking about the older generation, it's still, the women do this, men do this. So it's like, okay. So I was down there, and while most of the women were in the house after the funeral, talking to the different relatives, talking pleasantries, talking recipes, talking pictures and that type of thing, but not getting into anything with some substance, I was out with the guys. And see, one thing that is also a hindrance is many of my male family members from down south are actually part of Masonic lodges, and that code is that it's a Masonic lodge. Females aren't, no, you don't talk to females about stuff. A couple of them, I made sure they knew that I was invited to be part of a group, a research group for the Masons. So that sort of like eased them up a little bit, but not too terribly much, but they talked. So that was the main thing. So while we're down there talking, you know, I sort of asked them a couple of different questions, and I threw out a story of how one relative that we had killed a couple of other cousins for riding, I think I've told this story, about riding his mule too hard, and then he took his own life in 1911 by eating lye while he was in prison, waiting for his trial. That had them reeling, so I figured since I had them preoccupied and they weren't really concentrating, I said, oh, by the way, our great-grandma and great-grandpa buried here on the property. And you could just tell. First, the story that I told them about, they had no idea. I actually had to show them the story because they were like, oh, come on, we didn't know that. Nobody ever talked about that. Well, duh, nobody would. And then, needless to say, they had no clue as to where the older people are. The latest story I heard is that they might be they're not on the grounds of historic Liberty Hill Church. So the latest story I heard is that they are buried under a neighboring church because there is a crawl space under this one church where they had bodies. I don't know. I'm not gonna, don't plan on crawling under there to check. So over the years, I've been repeatedly admonished by various members of my family about asking so many questions. Duh, I was a reporter, used to be a cop. What do? We ask questions. So I tend to be kind of pretty good at that. Sometimes you meet with success, while other times, well, you know, I was never able to get any names, but I remember asking my mother about something that I heard accidentally while I was not really listening on purpose. We had a relative who, in order to get to work, and I never was able to find out where it was in Trumbull County, but the person lived in Youngstown and owned his own car. He would get and pick up a white person, and that person would ride in the car with him, and he would act as his chauffeur. Once they got close to the Girard-Youngstown line, he would get out and get into the trunk of his own car. And the passenger would go around to the driver's seat and would drive him through Girard, through Niles, and up to whatever point in Trumbull County where his job was. That was the era. That was, you know. So I've never been able to figure that out and never been able to get names, but I'm still working on it. When blacks began moving into neighborhoods above the red line, in regards to the redlining and things going on, homes would mysteriously catch fire, unwanted presents would be left, and various other forms of intimidation would be employed, usually until the family moved. It was in this environment that the Negro Motorists Green Book was born. Victor Hugo Green, and I've got a spare copy. She's writing notes frantically. I'll give it to you. Victor Hugo Green, named after the French author, was born in 1892 in New York, and his family later moved to New Jersey. He worked for the Postal Service and, once married, moved back to New York, in particular Harlem, because Harlem was starting to pick up and become a cultural hub in that era. Seeing and experiencing the lack of accommodations for blacks when they traveled, he sought to come up with a tool to address the issue. So, enlisting the help of other postal workers across the country, he began to gather information about locations which would be open to black patrons. He began compiling a list of first-class hotels, restaurants, service stations, and other facilities that would welcome the Negro motoring public, where they could be served or stay without ridicule. His first edition, which was published for the New York metropolitan area in 1936, it was supposed to be just for that area. It included some hotels, but something also called tourist homes or private homes where you could rent a room and stay. That was in that book. The response to that publication was so overwhelming that it continued to grow, and it started to include barbershops, black establishments, and other places. Now, S.O. Standard Oil was one of the few companies which offered gasoline franchise service opportunities to blacks. And as a result, that became the perfect place for these books to be sold. The publication continued to grow, more pages, more advertising, more listings, more states. For a 4-year period between 1942 and 46, the publication suspended operation because of the war. But when it resumed in 1947, Green introduced a reservation service, which was like a then type of AAA for the traveling public. They would book things and schedule things for somebody that would call and ask. About 15,000 copies of the Green Book were printed annually. When Green died in 1960, his widow, Alma, sought to continue his dream and produce the publication until about 1966. Now, there were several factors in why it stopped. You had the 1954 Supreme Court ruling dealing with Brown versus Board of Education. You had the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Act. And there were those things that were working to make things a little easier and less restrictive for African Americans during that time. Green is attributed to saying that there will be no need for the Green Book when, quote, we as a race all have equal rights and privileges in the United States. Now, currently, there are projects underway to document the life and efforts made by Green. A documentary is in the works. Sites which were once on the route, which still stand, are facing scrutiny by preservationists who are looking to preserve it. And in the fall of this year, when the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture opens, they will have an actual exhibit dealing with the Negro Motorists Green Book. These books are extremely hard to find. Ford Motor Company has a digitized version online. The Schomburg Museum up in New York has the majority of the copies, which they have digitized and have made available to the public. You can't print them or copy them. Yes, they are online that you can look at. And they have, like I said, almost all of them except the first and maybe the last and maybe one or two in between. But they were determined to find a book for this exhibit in Washington, and they found one copy. It was tattered, torn, beat up. $22,500 they paid for this book. This book is rare. They usually don't exist. But the thing is that there's probably 5 million of them in somebody's attic someplace. But trying to find that one attic that hasn't been cleaned out by somebody's child that said, oh, what's this? You know. And that's always a problem. With the passing of time, those who understood the significance of the publication have passed on. Many have been simply lost. You've got time and deterioration and elements that have claimed some other ones. And then you have kids that just, they clean out mom or grandma or grandma's house and just leave stuff there. They don't care because they don't see the relevance of it. Now, the greater Youngstown Warren areas were among those included in the publication, the Green Book, throughout the years. The only structure which is still standing and which is functional right now is the Rescue Mission building. That was one of the places where in some of the guides, the Negro motoring public were directed there for a meal, for a shower, for a place to sleep, and that type of thing. That's the only building that still stands that is working. There is...
Tell them why. What was that before it was a rescue mission?
Colored Y. Mm-hmm. So that's, yeah, I'm sorry, that was on the next page, a colored Y.
Oh, okay.
And it would provide overnight housing and lodging. I did mention the Schomburg. Let me see. Several different cities in Ohio were also mentioned, but I did want to mention that there is a building, and it's not, yeah, it's not the it's not the Lion, it's the other one.
Yeah.
And I actually have a picture of it, and I'm blanking on it. I meant to put that in here. It's, I might actually have it in these notes someplace, but there's a little dilapidated hotel type of building. It's got the nice yellow B on it, meaning it's going to be demolished on McGuffey Road between Liberty and Jacobs. Yeah, between Liberty and Jacobs. That used to be one of the hotels. That, needless to say, is not functioning. There's another one that shows up if you Google the address. And that would have been the Red Lion on Coatesville Hubbard Road, but that's a vacant lot right now.
If it's not there anymore, but if you go on Google Earth, the Black Theater on Jacobs Road,
Yes,
the United
theater.
building is still on there.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the current, they tore it down, but you can see the building, what it looks like on, I think it's 1849 Jacobs Road. So
Okay.
the building was still there in 2011 when they did, the last time they did.
The imaging.
The imaging, yeah, so you can see what it looked like. And that was, and I don't know if that shows up in the Green Motorist book, but that was listed in a national book of black theaters, theaters that were safe, that did not segregate during the middle part of the century. They did this entire listing for the whole country, and it has the Regent Theater on East Federal Street was in there, and that theater for this area.
Okay, cool beans. And we're going to get to you in a second because he's working on a project which is kind of cool too. let me see, the collection, when it came to Ohio, Akron, Cleveland, Columbus, Toledo, Zanesville were among the cities selected for inclusion, in large part due to the migration routes of African Americans across the state. By the 1939 edition, the Lynham and German's Cocktail Bar and Restaurant at 644 Pine Southeast in Warren was one of the first locations that was listed. That's not there anymore. In 1941, the YMCA, which is a colored Y, that was the first time that it appeared, and that was in 1941. By the mid-1940s, publications had expanded to include lists of tailors, taverns, drugstores, nightclubs, and other entities to help broaden its appeal. It also included pieces on and points of interest, tips for Negro travelers, and other informational matter. In 1951, they did a railroad special edition touting the appeal of traveling by rail, and many other editions over the time included travel to Canada, Bermuda, Costa Rica, and Mexico. They did features on popular cities such as New York, New Orleans, and other destinations which would welcome Black travelers. A glance in the 1952 edition shows Youngstown was pretty well represented with restaurants, nightclubs, and other establishments that were here. There are a couple I want to mention. The Ride Out Hotel was at 838 Lincoln Avenue in the city. And then there was also at 701 West Strand Avenue, Harris Barber Shop. And one of the relatives of the barber is our own Judy Williams. Yes. That was, what was that? Your great, how was he related to you? Mr. Harris? Your grandfather. 701 West Strand. Yeah, so much of that is just gone, and that's that whole. Yeah. In 1954, many of the same establishments are still there, but there were two additions. First, the Allison Hotel, the Hotel Allison, which was moved a couple of times, but this one time it was at 212 Northwest Street, and that was in the old Monkey's Nest. And then it later moved to Lincoln Avenue. Benny Allison was the owner of the facility, and recently I had a chance to speak with him and about his father's business. One of my classmates actually is a relative, and when she moved from out of town here, she remembered working in the hotel. She was just, little. By this time, Youngstown was attracting Black performers such as Ray Charles, Fats Domino, Brooke Benton, Hank Ballard, B.B. King, Stevie Wonder, many of whom were not welcomed in some of the other hotels that existed. And the fact that the Allison also offered a kitchen which would provide meals for the bands after they performed was a bonus, because you would often have them coming there to those hotels, to that particular hotel, because of that amenity. That edition also had the first appearance of the only one that I've been able to document, which was a tourist home, one of those homes where you could come rent a room, and that was at 327 Belmont Avenue, and that basically sits in that one corner of Charlie Staples' parking lot now. That building no longer exists. We Motel was the one on McGuffey Road. That's 2705. I thought I put it in here. Let me see, that was another one. And then the Red Lion Motel that I mentioned earlier, Mr. Allison said that many of the Black musical acts who performed in Western Pennsylvania would stay at the Coysville Hubbard Road establishment. It's vacant now. The last edition that the Schaumburg has of the Negro Motorists Green Book is from 1963 to 1964, which is the international edition, and included a caption stating travelers, Green Book assured protection for the Negro traveler.